Good afternoon, colleagues. We'll get started. Thanks to all of you for coming. We're here, of course, to learn a little bit more together about the budget model redesign. So I'm just going to make a couple of introductory remarks, and then others will take over. So we have been talking about our budget process and possible changes to it, possible other models, for several years for a number of reasons. Because it's a time of increasing financial constraint, because our models are complex and the relationships between decisions that get made within units and what happens to the budget are not clear, and because our costs continue to outpace our revenues. So we want the idea of changing the model of the budget is to make it more transparent and to put the decision-making closer to people who actually understand the decisions. So we wanted to promote a better understanding of the challenges that we have and engage more people directly in the decision-making, to have better linkages between strategic planning and resource allocation. So I asked Janice if she, in her capacity as provost, would put together a steering committee to recommend a budget model. There's been quite a bit of conversation about the possibilities, and this is the committee that was established. And you'll see here that there are people with different kinds of engagement with the budget process, different roles representing different kinds of responsibilities. And the attempt was to try and find a variety of different roles, so different perspectives on the budget process itself, from a variety of different constituencies, because we know that different parts of the university have different balances among their budgeting concerns. So this is the committee that's been working. I appreciate all the willingness from them to participate in this. As many of you will know from announcements and from talking to your colleagues, if you've been involved in conversations with these folks, and from the consultation that's been going on, this is a very hard-working group of people. They've been trying to balance a number of different forces and ideas and priorities, and we're going to hear from them about where they've arrived at now.
Thank you, David. I'm so glad to see that we have such a good turnout here this afternoon. Unfortunately, there's one chair. Nobody seems to want to move to that one chair. Other than that, so I'll just let you know what we're planning to do this afternoon. We're going to make a presentation. You'll be hearing from myself as well as from David Collins and Kathleen Sobey, who are the project champions, and Andrew Laws, who is from Huron Consulting, will also be able to answer questions and provide his analysis based on his work with a number of other universities who have been engaged in a similar process. I'd also like to point out some members of the steering committee who are here today, because they may also want to provide comments and insight based on their involvement with the committee. So Dan Bayliss is here from the Department of Psychology, Jonathan Beddoes, Joanne Kesselman, and Brandy Smith. Where's Brandy? Okay, good. All right. So as David mentioned, we've been having conversations about our budget model for a number of years, and those discussions have happened with deans and other members of the senior leadership team. And as a result of those conversations, we've heard a lot of frustrations the way the current model works. And many have been talking about the need for a consideration of a new approach to allocating resources in a way that's going to better support our academic mission, all of our interests in teaching and research and in supporting our students. So as part of our work on the steering committee, we use the support of Huron to assess our current budget model and to hold interviews and different engagement sessions with many different members of our university community to get their feedback in terms of what they perceived as some of the challenges with our current model. And the following slide just offers a summary of what we see as some of the restrictions of our current model. And then I'm going to also speak about ways in which a decentralized model might offer us some improvements. So I think it's important to note that our current budget model is called an incremental budget model. And that means that all of the funds that the university receives, the provincial operating grant, fees from tuition, research grant funds, all of those funds are flowed centrally right now. And then we determine the budgets and that are needed at the faculty levels and the costs that we have to cover in the other units. So with an incremental budget model, it also means that annually we have to determine whether or not units are going to receive an increase to their baseline budget or a decrease. And we know that in recent years, really what we've been talking about are significant cuts. Units have been experiencing 3% to 4% reductions in their baseline funding. And then we apply those cuts across the board so that it's applied equally across all units. What that has meant, though, is that the impact of those cuts are felt differently within different units. But when you do across-the-board cuts, there's no accounting for some of the different contexts or financial realities that some of the different units are facing. That's not considered in our current allocation process. So what that means is that units see very little benefit in some of their efforts to do some new things, like offering new programs or attracting new students. They don't see a direct benefit or any kind of response to that different approach. In our current model, I would say there's also very little transparency in this process. So the money, as I said, is allocated centrally, and then we go through an annual process where we ask units to tell us about some of the resources that they think that they need in order to achieve their strategic goals. And we make that decision amongst a relatively small group about what allocations we're going to support. But no one really sees some of the money that is distributed when it's distributed centrally to support all the other functions of the unit. Those costs, those revenues remain unclear and not as transparent as we'd like them to be. And then finally, our university's budget system is managed right now through a large number of Excel spreadsheets, which I have to say I found kind of astonishing when I moved into this role, considering the size of our budget. And so that means there's the possibility of risk and error. So what might a more decentralized budget model look like? And you'll see that on the other side. And you're going to hear more details about this, so I'm just going to talk about this at a higher level. But in a more decentralized budget model, all the funds that we receive, again, the provincial grant, tuition fees, research funds, flow directly to faculties, who then are able to keep the majority of their revenue and then give up some funds to support central costs and a central pool that you're going to hear more details about. The benefit of this, from my view, is that it's highly transparent. Everyone sees what the revenues are and what the costs are. And you have, in particular, a greater sense of some of the costs involved in supporting some of our services, like the services that we have to support students and in HR, and people have a clear picture of what those costs are. In addition, I think it means that decisions are going to be made at more of a local level. So rather than the decisions about spending being made by a central committee of a few people who determine what the allocations are, now faculties will have greater responsibility and authority to make those decisions and to plan for longer periods of time. And the new decentralized model that we are proposing is also going to be supported by a new software tool that Kathleen Sobey will tell you more about. And this, I think, is a really important and necessary improvement. It's going to ensure that the information that we have is standardized, there'll be data integrity, and I think very importantly, it's going to allow for some forecasting and future planning in ways that our current use of Excel spreadsheets really simply don't allow. The next slide just tries to put this initiative into a larger context. And so just to let you know that many, many Canadian universities are looking at this issue of how to allocate resources in a different way. And you can see on this that some universities began this process earlier, McMaster and U of T, which is good because we can learn from their experiences, whereas a number of other universities are slightly ahead or relatively in the same place that we are in looking at a new budget model. I think what's important to know is that there isn't just one model that all universities are now adopting. I'd say that there is a trend to move to more decentralized models, but within that, there are a number of different options, and the steering committee's work was really to determine a model that we felt was best for our university, for our culture, and for our context. I've mentioned guiding principles before, but I think it's important again to restate that here as part of the context for how we're moving forward. And one of the first tasks of our steering committee was to establish a set of guiding principles that would underline our work and our recommendations for moving forward. And so I'll just review these again. So the first principle is to ensure that a budget model will align resource management, planning, and allocation with the university's mission and strategic priorities. So in other words, we're driven by our academic mission, and the budget model supports that. We're not driven by our budget model. The second principle is that we wanted to adopt a budget model that would enhance collaboration between and within academic units and central support units. Again, really important because there are a range of decentralized models, and at the extreme end, there's something known as responsibility-centered management, which really is about units now competing with one another. That wasn't where we wanted to land with our budget model, so we are what we call a more decentralized, not as extreme as RCM, and that means that we still want to ensure that there is collaboration because we care about things like interdisciplinarity. So that was an important principle. We're also trying to develop a model that's responsive and aligns revenues with expenses. And I think this is where I've heard from deans, for example, where right now under our current model, if enrollment increases, deans will see the expenses that result from taking on more students, but they don't see the revenue that flows with that to help them cover those increased expenses. But a decentralized model would allow for that kind of responsiveness. We also want a model that's going to promote fiscal understanding. And if you ask most people, they really don't understand our current budget model. A lot of things are based on history, which no one fully understands how things have proceeded in the way that they have. And so we want a model that everyone has an ability to understand. And so therefore, we also have the final principle, which is to be straightforward and transparent, something that isn't overly complex. And hopefully you'll hear that later in the presentation today. In terms of the model expectations, again, I think it's important to just reinforce that a budget model is just that. It's a budget model. It's a way of understanding how we're going to allocate resources and how we're going to cover costs, how funds are going to flow in our institution. The budget model isn't going to solve the university's current financial situation. It isn't going to help us achieve our strategic priorities. The budget model alone isn't going to be about enhancing efficiencies. Those kinds of activities have to take place by the university community as a whole. So the budget model is not a solution to some of these things that we have to engage in and continue to engage in. And also, the budget model doesn't replace all of the academic governance committees and processes that remain in place and that guide our academic mission. So the steering committee was formed in May, as David Barnard mentioned. We've had many, many meetings. We've had many discussions with deans and business managers. We had two very intensive retreats in December. And as a result of that, we were able to put forward some recommendations to the president about where we thought we should start with our decentralized budget model. And I'm pleased to say that David did accept all of our recommendations. And so what we're able to present to you today is that recommended starting point. And again, I want to emphasize it's a starting point, because as we continue to go through this process, and you'll hear more about a parallel process, we need to ensure before we actually make the decision of going in this direction, we have to ensure that it's going to have the impact that we want it to have and not have unintended consequences. So there's still time for us to tweak and refine the model. I think, let's see, it's also important, you'll hear more about this from Kathleen, that the model we're proposing is an all-in operating funds model with nothing held back, and Kathleen will clarify what that includes. So before I turn things over to David Collins, I'll just comment and say that there's still ongoing work that we have to be engaged in and that we will be engaged in. We'll be developing some committees to manage the new budget model, and David will give you some details about what those new committees might look like. The software that we mentioned is going to be loaded and tested, and following that, there'll be a number of training sessions. And of course, I'm going to continue to provide updates to the Senate Planning and Priorities Committee. There'll be updates provided to Senate. I'll be continuing to work with deans at the Deans Council, and we'll have open forums to ensure that you have information in terms of how we're progressing with this initiative. So now I'm going to turn things over, and we're going to get into more of the details, and I'll ask David Collins to talk about the new budget model.
Thanks, Janice. So, as Janice said, a budget model is really just a compilation of guidelines and policies that define how funds move around institutions like ours. They don't in and of themselves generate dollars. They don't dictate strategy. Unfortunately, a poorer budget model can get in the way of those processes. It can make it difficult for us to do things that we want, to generate additional income, to achieve strategic objectives. And unfortunately, our model, which is Janice explained as an incremental model, has over the years become more bloated with policies and regulations and accommodations that we've had to make. It's really no longer sufficiently responsive for our needs. It's time we look at it. In fact, we've been talking about looking at it now. When I started as a dean in 1999, in my first budget cycle, I appreciated that there were some issues. Those issues continue. So we've entered into a process. We're looking at a quite different mechanism for distributing funds around the university. As Janice said again, our current model, finances come into the top of the university, flow through a series of sieves of different sizes that no one knows a great deal about, and we end up with budgets allocated to faculty units. There's not a lot of engagement that we see as appropriate occurring in our model, and we need to address that. The mechanics of our new model are quite different. As Janice said, funds flow into the universities to specific units. So there are three features of the model that are really quite important. First of all, how we characterize the constituent components of the university, how the funds flow, and how we achieve balance at the end of the process to make sure everybody can function. So all units in the university are divided into two groups, academic and ancillary units, ostensibly our revenue units, and central support units. The academic units receive funds, the revenues generated by the teaching and research missions, and they flow out to the units using a process that Kathleen will expand upon a little bit later on. Central support units that address all our services to students, research services, libraries, etc. They will allocate the costs of their operations directly to the faculty as well. So you have funds flowing to the revenue flowing to the academic units and then the costs associated with central support also running to those units. It sets up a new dynamic that we haven't had to this point. I'd probably describe it more as a partnership opportunity. We actually work in concert to achieve the ultimate end of delivering the academic programs and the research output that we do. Academic units need support from the central units. That support needs to align. We're providing an opportunity to partner in achieving that alignment. Now, one of the problems with any budget model is making sure that the right amount of money goes to the right place in the university. And you'll see in the model that we're proposing, income, tuition income, provincial grant, research monies flow to faculties in inconsistent ways. We're a large unit. We've got a very broad mandate. We have a lot of programs. All of our programs are important. But all our programs have different numbers of students. There's different potential for tuition revenue. They have different areas of research with different costs associated with them. And we have to accommodate all of that. We have some specialty programs like music, very small niche programs, very expensive teaching operation, but it's an important faculty to the university. We have to address the needs of the professional programs. The costs of the professional programs, unfortunately, are generally considerably higher than some of the foundational programs, and they have to be addressed. The Faculty of Medicine does not bring in sufficient tuition to address the costs of delivering their programs. We're not going to cut any programs because of this model, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with a unit, an academic unit, not generating sufficient income to meet its costs. That's expected. It's the same in every university across the land. So we need to balance the income, and that's balance. The balance is achieved through a university fund. It's really a common tax on the income, on certain incomes generated by the faculty. Tuition-related incomes are taxed, but other incomes are not, and they generate different opportunities, and we will address that a little bit later as well. So the university fund is there to provide the cross-subsidy that's needed to make sure every boat has a bottom, that everybody has sufficient money to meet their targets, address their needs, and function as we expect them to in the university. On top of that, we need to make strategic investments. We need to shape the university, make decisions about where we want to go and achieve those strategic outcomes. And the only way to do that is to bring money back into the centre through this tax, because I reiterate, and it's important, all the money flows out to the revenue units. There is nothing central that is not brought back into central. The transparency inherent in that is also an incredibly supportive, important component of this model, and I think one of the really beneficial features, because there has to be a great deal of discussion, because the money movement is evident to everybody, and everybody, well, it's a university, everyone's going to want to have a say. There will be processes by which we entertain those suggestions, but there is nothing hidden here, and I think that's really a very strong component. So just a little bit about the academic units. So a revenue-generating unit is really defined by the ability to influence revenue generation, and obviously our faculties can through tuition, research, what have you, and our ancillary units can. The ancillary units are really a little bit on the side in this model, which is why they are grouped on the side on these slides. We expect the revenue units, the ancillary units rather, to generate revenue. We expect them to generate profit, and we then expect them to tip that profit back into additional investment that grows those ancillary operations that we need. They're treated a little bit differently in that whilst the academic units will receive an allocation of central unit costs, that same allocation won't be apportioned to the ancillary units. So that they really are not engaged in that partnership, they're not engaged in the discussions that will obviously arise there. All of the revenue generating units will be accountable for performance. They will retain both surpluses and losses, and hopefully surpluses. And as I said, they will contribute to this university fund through a common fee that will allow the university to function as an entity, to provide all the programs that we have to provide, and to help build the future that we want to achieve. And on that last point, also, as I said, the ancillary units will not participate in that component of the model. So central units, they have less opportunity to influence revenue, although some central units certainly do generate revenue. And those, obviously the cost associated with those units, the cost allocations out to the academic units will be net of any revenues that they do generate. They provide service and support to our academic units. They're critical to our academic mission. But in our current model, there's a lot of one-on-one interaction with the Provost's office and the Office of the Vice President Administration in relation to the budget, but there's actually no discussion between those that are receiving the services and those that are delivering the services. That's not productive. It leads to misapprehension and suspicion. It's very easy to criticize a component of our operations when you have absolutely no understanding of it. And this model will set up the possibility for people to discuss what the needs are, what sort of service levels they expect, what sort of efficiencies they would like to see, concerns they may have about cost of operations. It's an entirely different dynamic. And like, of course, the academic units, the central units are going to be accountable for operating within an expense budget, and we'll talk a bit about that. And their responsibility is to provide optimal services based upon service level understanding. In this model, as we develop budget, as these units develop budgets, there's got to be a discussion and the establishment of a series of baseline services that are provided, and leading to the expectation that there would be negotiation of additional services that may be needed in different parts of the university. So again, and I can't reiterate this enough, this partnership is really important to the future. So this is just to demonstrate how the support units are handled within the model. We've basically accumulated the different central units into 9 cost pools for the purposes of reporting in the income statements of operations. In the income statements each faculty unit will get, there will be a list of these 9 units and the costs that have been attributed to the faculty to support those units. Again, that's never happened. In our existing model, money's flow on the top, they're taken off the side. People don't know what the cost of those units are. It's not important, it's not relevant that one is more expensive than the other, but what is important is we understand why we're incurring those expenses and we make sure we leverage them appropriately. So this list, as people look at it, may not be 100% complete. We're still picking up and reallocating people to the various baskets. You'll notice that there is one in here labelled General University, which is probably only going to be in the initial operation of the model. It may wipe out completely as it evolves a little bit more, becomes more mature. But essentially that addresses university-wide funds, things like pension plans and insurance and what have you. And my colleague Kathleen Sobey will probably address that a little bit later on. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Kathleen.
Good afternoon. I get the pleasure of talking to you about our allocation methodology, that component of the budget model redesign. So when I say allocation, what that means really is all of the revenue that's allocated to faculties, as well as the central costs that are allocated to faculties, and another component which is the university fund. And David touched on that just a bit. So before I go into the exciting allocation method, I just wanted to reiterate that steering committee discussions were very engaging, and there was a lot of discussion around what is the best option for the university, which is what Janice was saying. So we were always directed by those same guiding principles. And if we got off track, then we would look back to those guiding principles and make sure that we were staying focused. So as I go through the allocation, I'm just going to refer back to some of the guiding principles so that you can see our rationale in making these decisions. So really one of the biggest components of revenue for the university is tuition. And undergraduate tuition in particular, when developing the allocation methodology for undergraduate tuition, the steering committee asked a few questions. So the questions we asked were what revenues should be allocated directly, what revenues should be allocated using variables or a variable driver, and what incentives should be created through revenue allocation. So based on the answers to these questions, the steering committee recommended 3 allocation pools for undergraduate tuition. And you can see on the slide, those are the boxes that are surrounded by the dotted line. Now, both the base, so we have 3. One is the base tuition, and that one's in the middle. One is program-based tuition, and then we have a premium pool. So both the base and the premium pool allocate tuition using credit hour as the driver. This ties revenue to an activity and really does recognize that there was a cost associated with that activity. So just diving further into how we're allocating out these 3 pools, the base tuition pool, what that represents is the tuition that's generated by faculties at the lowest credit hour rate. So when we modeled out 15-16, we were using the 15-16 actuals data from our financial statements. And the Faculty of Arts credit hour is $109 per credit hour. So this pool of $54.1 million really represents tuition generated at the lowest rate. We then looked at splitting that pool into an 85%, 15% split. The 85% is allocated in proportion to credit hours instructed by faculty, and 15% in proportion to credit hours taken by the student's faculty of record. So anything in the base pool doesn't include revenue that's generated over and above the arts rate. We pondered a lot on the split allocation and what the pros and cons were for that. But we did want to ensure that whatever the split was, it was designed to promote incentives for instruction, incentives for academic advising, recruitment, and retention. So I go over this in a bit more detail in the next slide. The second pool, the premium tuition pool, represents tuition generated at a credit hour rate over and above the base rate. The premium, we've allocated it 100% to the faculty in proportion to weighted credit hours instructed. So this weighting really recognizes how tuition is generated by different faculties and also in sense aligns with our revenue generating opportunity principle. And the last pool is the program tuition pool, and this represents tuition that's generated on a program-by-program basis as opposed to a credit hour by credit hour basis. So this includes programs in medicine, dentistry, and law. The program tuition is allocated at 100% direct to the respective programs. So the reason that we chose, part of the reason we chose 100% is it recognizes that tuition is charged differently than other undergraduate programs, and also we have limitations with using credit hours as the basis for allocations. And this also supports our principle of simplicity and transparency. So this slide is meant to give an understanding of how the university aligns with other institutions across Canada that also are in a decentralized model and how they decided to allocate undergraduate-based tuition. So there's really two extremes in how we can look at allocating the base tuition. We could allocate 100% of the tuition, getting feedback, to the faculty of instruction. So that really extreme, is it on? Extreme way is it recognizes the direct cost of instruction and allocates revenues to where the costs are incurred. But doing it 100% this way doesn't influence course completion rates, and incentives for academic advising are misaligned because this activity lies with the faculty of record. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, if we were to allocate 100% to the faculty of record, we're promoting recruitment and retention, but it doesn't recognize the cost of direct instruction. So considering this as well, the steering committee then considered how the other Canadian institutions operate under a decentralized model and how they allocate their undergraduate-based tuition. So on the slide, you can see that there's some universities. Some of those universities were on previous slides that Janice spoke to. But on the extreme end of the spectrum, Queen's University is more an extreme, operates under a more extreme decentralized model. They allocate 60% of their base tuition to instruction and 40% to the faculty of record. On the opposite end, McMaster and Toronto allocate 100% directly to the faculty of instruction. So with all this considered, cost of instruction, incenting course completion, incenting student recruitment and retention rates, the recommended starting point for the University of Manitoba is to allocate undergraduate-based tuition to the faculty of instruction and to the faculty of record using an 85% 15 split. What this really represents is the 4-year average between the costs of instruction and academic support costs at the university. The steering committee really did consider this as a really good balancing between collaboration between faculties while at the same time incenting recruitment and retention. So our graduate tuition in 15-16 was roughly $14 million. And when we modeled out graduate tuition, again, the steering committee recommended or considered a few things. One is the variation on how tuition is charged, such as a flat rate by term or by full-time versus part-time. Also considered the limitations we have on graduate credit hour data, considered the different modes of program delivery, as well as the cost of delivering graduate programs. So based on these considerations, the recommended allocation of all graduate tuition is 100% direct to the faculty of record based on graduate FTE. So we recognize that this does incent and it aligns with simplicity and transparency, but it does lose that incentive for collaboration. So in instances such as this, such as through joint programs, academic units are able to address this through collaborating with each other. I can't remember if the tuition conversation was more engaging than the operating grant tuition conversation. I think it just shows how passionate we were in discussing and how important it is. The operating grant is our largest source of operating income, so it was really important that we had engaging conversations. So when we were developing an allocation methodology for the provincial grant, we looked at a few things: what revenue needs to be allocated directly, what incentives can be created by allocating provincial grant dollars, and what drivers should be used to incent, to reflect these incentives. So based on the answers to these questions, we broke out the provincial grant into 2 pools. On the left is what we call our restricted grants or our earmarked grants. And then on the right is our operating grant. Restricted grants, about $13 million, represents funding that's for restricted purposes. So this includes our capital grants, our access programs, and funding for other targeted programs. The allocation of restricted grants is allocated 100% directly to the managing unit. So the balance of the provincial grant represents the operating grant, which is $341 million in 15-16 fiscal year. So the steering committee recommends an allocation method that promotes incentives for instruction, research, as I had said before, and we've divided the operating grant into 3 allocation pools. The first is support for academic and instruction. The second pool is to recognize the indirect cost of research, so it's a pool called indirect cost of sponsored research. And the third pool is faculty and graduate student support. The instruction and academic support pool represents 65% of our operating grant box, and this is about $221 million. So we've allocated this revenue in proportion to each faculty's undergraduate and graduate tuition. We feel that this allocation method recognizes the cost of instruction and academic support in relation to support that would be required for the research enterprise. So when we looked at what supports we would want to put in place for research, we looked at what the university's current indirect cost of research policy that is in place to support administration of research. So based on this, as well as some existing supports that we already have in place for research, such as our research support grant, as well as our indirect cost of research, steering committee recommended that we would allocate 30% of the operating grant in support of the research mission. This 30%, we've allocated it in proportion to each faculty's proportion of sponsored research revenues. And then the last tuition pool is faculty and graduate student support. This represents 5% of the operating pool, and it's allocated in proportion to each faculty's academic staff with rank and graduate students. This allocation method, it really recognizes that there are costs associated with research activities, but these activities aren't necessarily supported by sponsored research. So the last piece of the pie, per se, is other revenues. And this includes things such as distance tuition, student fees, or program-related fees, as well as the institutional costs of research. So when we considered the allocation methodology for other revenues, we rationalized that fees should first be used to cover the intended purpose, and the revenue, because the revenue is tied to an activity and there's a cost associated with that activity. So these include distance tuition of $10.5 million. It's allocated to academic units in proportion to distance credit hours instructed. And this allocation method provides an incentive for distance education. Secondly is targeted student fees. So that's this first bullet under student fees. In 15-16, this was roughly $23 million. And this includes things such as lab fees and the sport and recreation fee. So these fees are allocated 100% direct to the generating unit, aligning those revenue generations with the costs to where the costs are incurred. Institutional cost of research represents revenues that we recover from our research grants to help offset our institutional costs, and these are allocated directly to the generating unit, again aligning revenues with expenses. So the second bullet under student fees I'm speaking to last, mainly because it's allocated differently. $6.4 million represents student fees that are not necessarily attributable to any one unit. So this includes fees that students pay for registration, application, and library fees. These fees are allocated to academic units based on total student headcount. So David did touch on this in his presentation. There was more detail in his slide, but essentially this slide is showing the cost pools that we have as a starting point, we have 9 cost pools. And within each cost pool, there are various units which were on David's slides. So when the steering committee looked at how we wanted to pool all of the central units, what cost pool, we did consider quite a few things. The cost pool in which the units are placed, we wanted to balance that with transparency, but also simplicity. So to keep it simple and provide flexibility, reducing time spent on committees, the more central cost pools you have, the more committee time would be spent. We thought that the number of cost pools should be small to keep it simple and flexible. But to increase our transparency, we would require more cost pools. But increasing the number of cost pools also increases the complexity. So in striking this balance, the steering committee recommends, as a starting point, 9 cost pools, each with their own unique cost allocation variable that the committee feels best aligns with the activities. So the column on the left shows you the name of the cost pool, and the middle column there shows you the allocation variable that's used to allocate out those costs. So as a starting point, when we do go into a go-live year, the central support units, really their starting point is where they are today, and they will develop their budgets based on where they are today in terms of what their spend is, and it will be further down the line when David will speak to it afterwards, but when we look at the governance structure and how central units will prepare their budgets, there will be more of a transition for them further on. So again, we touched on the university fund a little bit earlier on. This really is a critical component of a more decentralized model. It provides the university the ability to act as one entity and to support our key strategic priorities and our mission-critical activities. So how is it developed, and what purpose does it serve? Well, it's developed by applying a common fee to select revenues that are generated by faculties. This includes our operating grant and all tuition with the exception of the other student fees that I had gone over before. So what purpose does the university fund serve? Well, first of all, it provides funding to faculties at implementation to hold them harmless. So while we transition to a more decentralized model, this means that faculties have the similar levels of funding that they did in a centralized model, but it gives time to transition, and we hold them harmless during this period. So what that means is the university fund needs to be large enough to sustain this, cover faculty deficits on the onset, as well as still give us that flexibility to guide the university. Secondly, the university fund needs to enable leadership to guide the university in a direction that benefits the university as a whole. So what this means is the participation rate, or the common fee, needs to be large enough to support our long-term initiatives, such as our capital investments or our seed initiatives. And then the last consideration of the university fund was allocations that we do provide from the university fund shouldn't be viewed as an annual entitlement or an ongoing allocation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Thanks, Kathleen. I'm just going to summarize things a little bit before we go out to questions, but I just wanted to say that I've been working in universities probably longer than I care to remember. Well, that's probably not true, because actually I've enjoyed working in universities for years. I love working here. They're inspirational places. There are people here that generate phenomenal ideas and make major contributions to the society, the society we live in and the disciplines we support. But the one thing we really are awful at is managing change. We will staunchly argue against changing some things that we know don't work, look for every reason possible not to engage in the change process. And that's understandable. We're analytical. The first thing we do is try and pull an argument apart. But we're really at the point where it's not reasons why we shouldn't do this. It's opportunity. It's how we actually manage the process, because we really do have to do this. We've prevented some of the decisions we've made to facilitate moving to the model, and I have to say some of these are still being reviewed. Kathleen looked at the distribution drivers for tuition and allocation of costs. One or two of those may change a bit. I think the basic structure is pretty good, but there may be some qualitative tweaks that we actually look at. But as we're considering these things, I think always reflect back on where we are at the moment. Kathleen mentioned that with the allocation of graduate tuition, 100% of the tuition goes to the faculty, the students enrolled with, and maybe that doesn't facilitate collaboration. Well, ask yourself, what happens in the existing model? First of all, the tuition doesn't go to you, and for the life of me, I can't see anything in there that promotes collaboration. There are things that we have to engage in outside of a budget model. That's important to the way we operate, and it's something we are going to have to work at doing a little bit better. And there are opportunities actually to come to agreements between faculties to allow funds to ebb and flow if that may be necessary. So we've provided here a sort of a pictorial overview of the model. I'd like to point out that the scale of our income pools is not a political statement about post-secondary funding in Manitoba. We do have to do some work there. That just represents where the money flows into the university. And as the picture demonstrates quite clearly, monies flow into the academic units, as we've demonstrated. Costs flow from the central units to the academic units. And then essentially we have this university fund which almost acts as a fulcrum here that allows the balance to occur. There's a couple of things that we haven't mentioned that we do need to clarify, and that is the budget model only works to a faculty level. Model stops at that level, and distribution within faculties rests in the hands of the deans in discussion with faculty and support staff. The modelling program we have certainly has the capability in larger units to allow flow to units within the faculty using similar allocation variables. And that's something that people will have to discuss, but probably over a longer period of time. I think it's probably important that we get the model actually nested in appropriately first. The other thing that we haven't mentioned to this point either is that the tool that we're developing to support this model, it's based on a Hyperion package, not only has the capability of allowing us to flow funds around and track that flow, it also has a modelling capability. So you can actually run what-if scenarios using this software. And we've all done this probably in our faculties, and I certainly used to. But the structure is there for us to do what if we introduce more students here, transfer students from one program to another, invest in research projects. Any process that you want to model is facilitated in this. It's really going to be quite a useful tool, and it will help us manage the future a little bit better. So what's next? Well, like every budget model, there's a budget management process, cyclic process where we engage in decisions for the next year and for the future. And what this represents really is just a typical management committee structure. It's not necessarily the structure that we're going to follow, but it gives some indication of what we're looking at. So on the top of the model, there is an executive budget committee that receives recommendations about budgets. And they make decisions, and that hasn't changed. That will exist in every budget model. The nature of the decisions they make will change because unlike our current process where people submit requests for small sums here and there, they're all going to be addressed within the the allocation structure. The sort of decisions are going to be bigger decisions, more strategic, decisions about where we want to go, what we want to be. So it's a more serious discussion, I think. And the flow of information to that committee will be different. There's a box on the bottom left-hand side labeled Central Unit Allocation Committee. That's a very important group. That's the committee that provides the partnership opportunity that I previously referred to. The central unit budgets will flow through that committee, and that committee will make recommendations to the Executive Budget Committee. So the composition of these committees hasn't been fully established yet, but it's clear that the Central Unit Allocation Committee is going to have a significant number of deans on it, because that's where the discussion is going to be had about the service levels that are being provided, expectations of service, limitations on what service can be provided, and setting baseline agreements for the services provided. It's a lot of energy going to be going into those discussions. It's a change, and the current structure, as I said when I stood up previously, there's a lot of one-on-one interactions in our current model. We don't need one-on-one interactions. We need the central units and the academic units to engage about what is necessary to deliver the programs. That advice then goes to the Executive Committee. We have on this model a facilities management committee off to the side, but effectively that is a central unit, and in our model it'll probably be a bit more hierarchical with the central units all flowing through the Central Unit Allocation Committee into the Executive Committee. So a lot of eyes are focused on all these budgets, and from the perspective of the extent to which what is being proposed, the plans that people have, are in concert with the objectives of delivering our academic programs. So this slide really just addresses an example of the process that we'll be enacting when it's mature. Obviously, it's going to take a few years to bed this model. There's a lot of change that needs to be accommodated. But typically, this is what we'll be looking at. In the early stages of the model and the table that we have here, you can see across the bottom there's the timeline, and then there are two rows here. One row, the row at the top represents tasks that have to be undertaken, and the row underneath it identifies the individuals or groups that are responsible for performing those tasks. So the model we would be proposing starts a little bit earlier, running from May to July. And at this stage, financial services and institutional analysis from the more analytical groups will be looking at forecasts, enrollment projections, and ensuring the variables that are used to drive allocations are accurate and in a state that they can be loaded into the model software to generate the budget as more information becomes available. Moving on to that, the next stage from August to September involves the central units and them preparing their budgets for presentation to the Central Unit Allocation Committee. Their budgets are going to be different from has been the case to this point. They're not going to be incremental asks. They're going to be plans about where they want to go, what they want to achieve, how they're responding to need, how they're addressing efficiencies, how they might provide better services. And that's going to be a discussion with the users of those services who will then relay that information through the process. So moving on to October to December, collecting funding requests from the academic units, the ancillary units. That's where the deans are going to engage in their input into the process. As I said, it's going to be a little bit different. There are going to be less incremental asks and more strategically focused asks. January to March, review of the funding requests by the executive leadership, and April to March, the mechanics of putting the budget together. And that's going to be an iterative process. This is, as I said, this is a mature process. It's a possibility. We're still playing around with how we intend to engage in this process. And lastly, when are we going to do this? Well, it feels like I've been working on it for 2 years already, but it's been at least 6 weeks. There's quite a lot of work before we go live, and what you see here is two tasks that we have to accomplish represented here. We're in the process now of preparing for the 17-18 budget. We'll soon learn about the monies we get from the province, and not far ahead of that, we'll be talking about budget allocations for this upcoming year. Nothing is going to change as far as that goes, but over the same year, we're going to have to test the logic of our new model. So we're going to be running effectively a parallel process. We are going to load all the drivers to generate a dummy budget, if you like, in the new process, and then test its predictive ability against actual expenditure as we go through the year to make sure the drivers match, that nothing's too far out, that we can't tweak it and make adjustments if necessary. Make sure the software functions as expected, give people lots of opportunity to pull out reports, look at comparative positions as predicted by the model against what we're actually doing. And at some stage during that year, we've got to reach a point where we're confident enough to say, yeah, for 18-19, let's introduce the new model. It's going to be a big issue for us to address. We have to be confident and definitely have to be confident in the model. And there's a lot of other work we have to do as well. There's a lot of engagement and training so that people understand how to interact with the modeling process, how to interact with the software, use it, load information into it. There are lots of policies and procedures that we have to realign. Unfortunately, in our existing model, we've incrementally linked different sources of revenue with different expenditures. All those are going to have to be realigned within the structure of the new model. And we're also going to have to start thinking about service agreements. There's a lot to accomplish, but we would like to get to the point that by about October, and I think October is probably the decision point we're going to be aiming for, we are ready to say, yes, we're going to progress into the new model. That does introduce some little challenges for us, because the decision, the no-go point, which is basically here, is around the middle of the year, and it's going to compress the amount of time we have for planning as we move into the new model. Or alternatively, if we make the decision that we're not ready, it's going to reduce the amount of time we have for planning to stay with the old model. I know that all my activities and efforts are engaged with making sure we do hit a positive decision point. I think a delay would be disastrous. I think we need to move. It's probably less of an issue for us moving into the new model, because as indicated here, what we're considering is a hold harmless year for the first year of the new model. So rather than a great deal of planning to position our needs, we haven't yet actually 100% committed to the decision, but we're close. It will alleviate a lot of the stress associated with budget planning and allow us to move directly into the model and start interacting with it properly.